Hello. I'm going to talk a little bit about preservation. Um, Before I get started on the topic of preservation and ultimately disaster recovery, which a lot of this general is in the book, but I'm going to take it from more of a personal perspective. In that, I have been trained in many ways by a woman named Jeannie Drews, who works currently for the Library of Congress. And we can talk about a little bit about it in the discussion pages. But I have been involved in the physical moving of books from one collection area to another, probably about at least 3 times in my career. One time I had to move the books in order to have friable asbestos removed from the floor tiles that had gotten wet, so that they could be removed and replaced before I'd move the collection back in. Specifically, I worked in a library where we had a lot of floods that came from the floor above. Chemistry libraries have a tendency to be in locations which have a tendency to get a lot of water. And I had shelf covers over the shelves to protect the books, which did work considerably one time when there was a fire on the floor above and water came down. And while it destroyed computers and plants, it did not destroy any books. The books were protected. More specifically, I've been involved in wet books, molded books, in my library and other libraries that I was responsible, that I could help with, and been books damaged by patrons. I've had I worked in one situation where there was a major line breakage in a floor in which there were books stored, journals stored, where it took out a lot of organic compounds. Anything that got wet had to be destroyed, and they had hired a hazmat crew to take care of the materials. And they allowed me to go down and look at my book collection. After about 4 days, I went down with police officers, and the interesting situation is we were given coveralls which had rubber boots, and we're walking, the 2 police officers and myself are walking toward the areas where my collections are. Meanwhile, individuals in full hazmat suits are coming in the other direction. And I think my one thought was, what's wrong with this picture? They've got full hazmat suits and I've just got little rubber booties and a coverall. And I ended up looking at my collection. My collection was in a room that was sealed from floor to ceiling and did not get wet whatsoever. However, I had to get the books out of the area because there was a great deal of moisture, which caused the books to start to mold. And I did get a bad eye infection at the time because of low, high humidity, low airflow. Airflow and humidity and different aspects are mentioned in the book about what is considered to be the primary method for keeping books. There's a temperature gradient that's mentioned in the book, and there is a humidity mentioned in the book. And you should follow those things whenever possible because they are very important for preservation of paper. So let's get talking a little bit about this, but what I'm trying to bring forth in this discussion is the fact that I have some personal aspects to preservation. So as we talk about preservation, disaster recovery in a lecture, which I hope will not be a horribly long lecture, I will talk a little bit about some aspects of personal situations as we talk about in discussions. I will bring up some topics as they occur in the conversations. So let's get started. Well, what is preservation? What is disaster recovery? Well, preservation is the preservation of paper in a library, primarily. When we're talking electronic materials, they're usually they're either not housed in the library at all, or they're housed in the library with backup copies in other locations. So you're not really worried about electronic materials, because electronic materials can be in a variety of different locations, some of which may not actually be physically in the building. So when we're talking preservation, we're actually talking about, in many cases, we're talking about paper products in a library. It could be audio, could be video, could be photographs, could be maps. Let's talk primarily about paper. Because there are some issues specifically with paper. Mind you, if you have a photograph collection of any kind of collection of that nature, you have to consider those as well. Some, like say a CD-ROM, if it gets wet, it may destroy the cover, but it does not necessarily destroy the CD-ROM. A fire would, but water would not. On the other hand, if you had a fire, then it's kind of a moot point on all these issues, because a fire is going to wreck everything. But if it gets wet and it's something like a CD-ROM, it may destroy the case, but not necessarily the product, which can be cleaned. There are cleaning devices for CD-ROMs. If it's a photograph, some photographs can get wet to a certain extent and not be horribly damaged, that they cannot be cleaned as a rule. So when we're talking about preservation, in many aspects, we're talking about paper materials, because paper is affected by both fire and water. Fire being a complete destruction of it, water being something that you could recover from. Now, public libraries tend, as a general rule, to rely on insurance, both for the buildings and for the collections. In other words, if a public library collection gets destroyed, chances are there's not a huge concern about it, because it's not a collection of note, but rather something that could be replaced. And so the insurance can usually handle things like buildings and collection insurance. Universities tend to be self-insured to like one I worked at was self-insured to $100,000. You had to have damages of greater than $100,000 for insurance to even concern itself. So you have to know what the coverage is for insurance for the building and for the collection, because of reliance on the insurance. The insurance is going to do one of two things. It's going to protect the building. It's going to protect the collection. It may give you some funding for recovery if that's what you choose to go with. Now, archives and other special collections use disaster recovery methods as part of preservation, and we'll talk about disaster recovery. Preservation, as a short answer, is maintaining the temperature and humidity that is appropriate for paper. I mean, that is, or photographs. If you have a photograph collection, you need to determine what is the proper humidity, what is the proper temperature for these things to be maintained. Often, libraries will have a higher temperature than what is proper for paper in order to be more comfortable for people. So you got to take in as aspect of what is comfortable for people and what is comfortable for paper. The book will have information about temperature and humidity. Well, in general, let's talk about preservation of library materials, specifically for, we'll say, public libraries. It has got to do with the cleaning of the books. It's got to do with smoke damage and minor repairs. Cleaning. Let's take a book used by children with a hard cover and a covering. Many cases are just simply cleaned with wipes to get rid of any stickiness from children. We're talking about the cover primarily. Now we're not talking about pages. We're talking about covers in this case. Smoke damage. This could occur in two ways. This could occur because the reader is a heavy smoker and the book smells of smoke, or it could be a situation where there had been a fire nearby. The book wasn't damaged, but it did receive smoke damage. You could use, very simply, you could use charcoal for smoke damage. Create a Tupperware type container, filled the bottom with charcoal, and then put racks in there in which you can put the books, and the charcoal will absorb the smoke. Now, there are minor repairs, such as tipped-in pages, torn pages, some spine damage. You can use special paper glues, usually available from an organization like, a jobber like Demco, because you don't want to use just general glue. You would prefer to use glue that is specific for paper, and you can get those from companies like Demco. The glue can be used for minor repairs. The glue with a brush can be used to tip in a page. That is a torn out page where you're tipping it into the spine of the book. Some of the glue can be used on torn pages or some spine damages. The other would be to buy book tape, specific tape for books to be handling the torn pages, for example. You don't want to use like Scotch tape or any other general tape. You want to use a specialized tape that is designed for books. Because if you use Scotch tape on a torn page, it's not going to last very long at all. And it's going to change in color and look rather not pleasant. So it's better to get the glues from the paper glues and the book tape, usually from places like Demco. That could be handled by pretty much any library that has like small damages, like you get a book back from a patron and they inform you that a page is torn out, or you discover a page is torn out. Now, this would be for books that you're going to actually keep for a period of time rather than weed them from the collection. Minor repairs, like torn pages that you have to tip in, are not sufficient necessarily to weed a book from the collection, but it will give you longevity to have the book on the shelf until the time comes that you reconsider its use. Of course, before you do any repairs, you should reconsider its use. Now, this is for a generic book repair that anyone can do with some small classes or even watching some things on YouTube. Well, the next issue that I really want to talk about, more than the things that you can get, simple repairs or things that you can get from the book, let's talk about disaster recovery. This is the process, the manuals, the different things that talk about what happens if something dramatic happens. Now, dramatic can be just a single shelf of books. It could be something more complex, like several stacks of books. Situations where maybe the roof leaks and some books get wet. Let's talk about what to handle in cases of something that's more than just a couple books. We're talking about like a stack of books. And this is something that you should have ready to go for when it does happen. You should have a disaster manual. We'll talk about those in a second, but in the disaster manual, you should have listed important phone numbers to call. Not just the fire department and the police, such as the book refers to, but a phone tree, a list of people to call in the library if something happens that goes through the sequence of information. The one library I worked at, which had a preservation librarian, you would call the preservation librarian first. You might contact the director, even secondary to the preservation librarian, or it depends on the library, and individuals that you would call in the library in a phone tree, in addition to any emergency numbers that you might have, or individuals outside the library that could help. You should list in your documentation all the possible areas of library where damage could occur, times of year the damage could occur. I worked in one library where there was a river, and the river was known to flood. There was like a 25-year flood. And so the implication would be you could possibly have a flood that affected the library every 25 years when the water rose. What would happen if the water rose in the library? Are there areas in the library that are accessible to damage that you know about, that could occur in very specific situations? So list those areas where damage could occur, like I said, like a 25-year flood zone. Now, another thing that you can do with wet books is, if you've got a lot of wet books, the very first thing you could do is put them into a freezer. Freezing the book is going to stop any damages from the water by freezing the book. There's two aspects to freezing that can help. The first and foremost is it immediately stops any damage at the moment that is more than you could do by repairing it at the moment. We used to have areas of wet books where we would get like boxes of wet books, and we knew the freezers that we could use, and who would allow us to use them, depending on the number of books we had. And we would box up the books. We used a plastic box, not a paper box. There are actually plastic boxes you can buy, because you don't want to use a paper box for paper books. You'd want to use a plastic type box. And these were foldable boxes. They were flat and they could be folded out like a regular box, but they were made of a corrugated plastic. You would put the books in these things, and then you would pull them to a freezer, freeze the book, and then it gave you time to work. The other aspect of freezing is something known as sublimation, which is when water goes directly from a frozen state to a gaseous state and never reaches the liquid state in between. Sublimation is often seen in the winter with snow, in that you can have a pile of snow and it can be really cold but dry in the air, and so the snow evaporates. It never thaws. It goes directly from solid to gaseous, and that's called sublimation. The other thing is to note in your documentation locations of companies that can help you. And in the documentation, you should concern yourself with what to do in the case of various damages that include unsafe conditions. Unsafe conditions is you probably need a emergency mask. Now, we're not talking like a cloth mask or anything. We're talking about primarily it could even be a specialty mask. At one point, I was going to be fitted for a regular mask, and as you know, I have a beard and mustache. These masks, a lot of times, you have to be clean shaven. Men need to be clean shaven to wear the mask because it needs to fit tightly on the face. You need a mask that's going to protect yourself, and some of them can be very basic masks that you buy like at a Home Depot type store. Others need to be more controlled, and so you need to consider the mask. Who would wear the mask? You need safety gloves, basically like leather latex type gloves. Rubber latex gloves. And then, of course, who is authorized to use the gloves, and know how to use them and have been trained in using them. You should have emergency safety tape, much like those tapes used by police or fire, something that you can put up to block out an area. Consider what would happen if shelves tipped over, and they were no longer safe. You should have interleaving papers. I talk about that in the book, where you put papers in between pages that are wet, that allow you to dry them. Another thing you can consider, and we mentioned charcoal in the previous slide, there's another device called a smoke sponge. It's a sponge that you can rub on paper to take out a smoke smell. What happens in mold? I've had situations where I've had moldy books, and you had to clean them. There's processes that you need to figure out how to handle if the book is moldy. I was in a situation where these were books that I had to keep, therefore I had to protect them against mold, how to clean the mold. In general, in many libraries, if something is molded, you're going to discard it in some fashion. But we're operating under the assumption that it's something that you need to keep. Something that would be in an archives or a special collection. Now, one of the things you can do is as we had a barrel, like a Rubbermaid type barrel, in which we kept all the documentation, we could find the sponges, the masks, the gloves, the tape, everything we had a barrel. In the barrel was everything we needed, including a copy of the preservation manual and a list of everything that was in the barrel. And the barrel would be inventoried on an annual basis to make sure everything was in good condition and available. But one of the things you can do for restoration is you can make lists of people who can repair books, or you can hire someone trained to repair books. One library I worked at, they actually hired a specific person that had that unit that was trained, who's actually a could do book repairs that were of a high quality. So if you have a case where you need to have books repaired that are more than the standard tip-ins that most people do, you should probably have a list of people who can actually physically repair a book. There are people who can repair books that look like they've never been damaged, and you need to have a list of people who can do those things. How much they would charge, and how often they would, how much could they do. Again, it comes insurance. You need to determine your coverage and what accounts you would pay for example, for these independent restorers. As I mentioned, even about the barrel being checked on an annual basis. You should maintain a disaster manual on an annual basis. You should not make it less often. If you're going to not do it annually, you should at least do it every 2 years. The manual names of people, phone numbers that you use are going to constantly change. And so whatever changes should be changed. You should check them. You should check the manual on a more frequent basis. Now, in addition to physical issues related to books, you should have a medical type manual, which covers all forms of medical calls. In other words, if somebody gets injured in the library and you have to send them to the emergency clinic, whether or not it's an employee or a patron, you need to keep a manual of what to do, who to call, and what you do in certain situations. Are there individuals trained in CPR? Do you keep a copy of a defibrillator in the library, which you should probably have? Who knows how to use it? You should make sure everyone uses it. Do you have Narcan to protect against overdoses, if that's a situation that could occur? What is your state's law protecting you? The state I'm in has what's referred to as Good Samaritan law, which means that if you make an honest effort to help someone, you're protected. Does your state have something similar to a Good Samaritan law? In the medical manual, in addition to the documentation that's in the manual, you should also have forms of medical calls. Anytime a person needs medical attention, you have a form in which one person enters the information and signs it that they're the ones that had to deal with a medical call. Keep a list of all situations, even when a medical is not needed. Somebody might trip or something and feels that they do not need medical attention. You still need to keep a list of that, even when medical is not needed, so that you know that somebody got injured tripping over something that could be easily repaired later. You could say, they tripped over a carpet, like a throw rug. What do you need to do about the throw rug so that no one else trips? And that's an example. So keep a list of all situations, a manual, even if medical is not actually needed, that something had occurred. Even if you keep electronic form, you should probably have a printed form because you need signatures of staff. Sometimes people keep information about medical electronically, but there should be also a printed copy, so you have a history that's easy to go through if you need to. It's a little less easy if it's electronic. It can be done. It's better if you have a printed copy, and even if you have an electronic copy, that there's a printed copy for quick viewing. So let's in brief, the level of preservation depends on the collection. There's preservation for the temperature and humidity to maintain things correctly. It may not necessarily be the temperature that you want for people. And while you can do simple repairs, you should have a list of who can do better repairs if needed. It all depends on if you're talking a public library where you're not going to keep materials if they're seriously damaged versus a library or an archive or a special collection where you're going to keep materials regardless because you're going to take every effort to repair it. So, I hope I take this from a perspective of a person who is familiar with the area And if you have any questions at any point, I try to keep fairly up on preservation, and I've done enough of it in my career to have a good feel for it. I also know individuals who have written books, journal articles, and things that you can use as well. So, with that in mind, remember, if you ever have any questions, you can send a message to me at the virtual office. You can send an email message. But more importantly, let's cover these topics and discussions. If you have any questions about preservation and materials, if it's not in the book, I may be able to provide some additional information. Take care, and let me know what kind of library, kind of preservation area that you need to consider. That may help in our conversations. Thank you very much.